This is Counter-Argument, a Middle East podcast from the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University. In the United States, Salafism has become synonymous with Islamic fundamentalism or Jihadism. But what do we really know about Salafism? Our guest today is Raihan Ismail, author of Rethinking Salafism, the Transnational Networks of Salafi Ulama in Egypt, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, and the Goldman Faculty Leave Fellow at the Crown Center for the 2022-2023 academic year. We spoke with her about misconceptions surrounding Salafi thought, the surprising diversity in Salafi traditions, and the significance of local context in shaping their positions on issues such as Shi'ism, women, and allegiance to rulers. My name is Naghmeh Sohrabi. We are the Crown Center for Middle East Studies, and this is Counter-Argument. Welcome, Raihan. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you today.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to ask you how you got interested in this topic. I'm specifically thinking about your latest book, which is a comparative study of Salafis in a multiplicity of countries, so Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Kuwait, if I'm not mistaken. It's a fascinating book, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about it today. But before we do, tell us how you got into this topic.
Well, thank you, Naghmeh. I started my PhD working on the Saudi clerics and their attitudes towards the Shia. And for me, I was very interested in trying to understand the rhetoric of Saudi clerics, and especially the fact that they were very hostile towards the Shia. And as I was working on this PhD project, I've also identified that Saudi clerics were very well connected, and they fostered networks with clerics from other countries, including Egypt, Kuwait, and even Southeast Asia and South Asia. So they're very well connected. And that's why I felt that it was probably important to understand the networks of these clerics and see how they try to foster collective Salafi identity, how they work together. And what was really fascinating for me was the fact that they were so active on social media. So they were tweeting and supporting each other on Twitter. They have their own YouTube channels. And it was just amazing to see that transnational solidarity, as well as their fascination with each other and the fact that they would travel, attend conferences and so on, and very supportive of each other. And that's when I felt that maybe there's something there. And I really wanted to look at the transnational networks of Salafi clerics. And I selected Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt because these clerics from these countries were very prominent and popular.
So they were the influencers of the Salafi networks?
Absolutely.
What did it mean for you as a woman, basically doing this research? Was it hard to gain access, or was it mostly online, what you were doing?
It was a bit difficult for me to have access to some of these clerics. One, they're very conservative. And second, traveling through the region can be a bit difficult as well for me. So what I've managed to do is to really examine their publications, lectures, sermons, observe social media accounts as well. Most of these clerics are prolific. They're very vocal. They're also self-promoters. So when they tweet, they want everybody to see their tweet. When they deliver a sermon, they upload their sermons instantaneously on YouTube. And it was very easy to access their work. And I felt that it was also important for me to be able to speak with them. And I think one way to mitigate the challenges or my inability to engage with these clerics in person is to contact them online. So what I've managed to do is call into Salafi satellite channels and ask them a question. And that was fascinating because they were very receptive, and they have their own Salafi satellite channels. They really want to promote their work. They really want to talk about their credibility as religious scholars.
Well, that's really smart. I don't need to tell you, but when people say in English, Salafi, I think it's become basically synonymous with fundamentalists, for lack of a better word. Who are the Salafis? What is a Salafi? When you say a Salafi cleric, what are you defining that to be?
Of course. I would say, in simple terms, the Salafis identify themselves as a Salaf as-Salih, which means the followers of the pious ancestors. And the Salafis are Sunni Muslims. Their aim is to emulate the first three generations of Muslims. Those are the Muslims who were closely proximate to Prophet Muhammad. And the Salafis call for the return to the correct religious practices and advocate for the return to what they say is authentic Islam. So this means relying on the Quran and the Prophet's traditions. Various Salafi movements emerged throughout history, I would say. And these movements claim to be Salafis, and each movement had their own interpretations of Salafi ideals. But I would say the modern face of Salafism is the ultra-Orthodox Salafi movement advocated by the Saudi religious tradition, which is also known as Wahhabism. And if you don't mind, maybe I can talk about Wahhabism a little bit.
Please do.
Oh, thanks, Naghmeh. It is named after its founder, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. And Ibn Abdul Wahhab promoted a strict interpretation of Islam. So he denounced practices that he saw as amounting to infidelity to God. So these included shrine visitations and praying to saints. And he thought that these practices were shirk, which can be defined as associating God with other beings. The campaign to purify Islam from these corrupt practices targeted Sufis, targeted the Shia. And this campaign also targeted Sunni tribes that refused to adhere to the correct, principles according to Ibn Abdul Wahhab. So I would say that when Saudi Arabia, backed by the petrodollar, started to sponsor transnational religious education and travel, the Wahhabi strand of Salafism became the face of modern Salafism.
So I'm just thinking about the misconceptions that we have, particularly in the United States, on these issues. But people, for example, think the Muslim Brotherhood is a strict religious movement. And my understanding is that actually there's a world of difference between the Brotherhood and Salafi movements. You talked a little bit about Saudi. I was wondering if you can answer this question in the context of Egypt. For example, how are the Salafis in Egypt different from the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt?
So the Muslim Brotherhood is a political movement that promotes societal, political, and economic change within the framework of religion. And I would say that Salafism and the Muslim Brotherhood share similarities in their vision to Islamize Muslim societies. But having said that, the Muslim Brotherhood draws from a different religious tradition and does not share Salafi conservatism. In the context of Egypt, Salafis in Egypt are a lot closer to the Saudis and their interpretations of Islam. Salafis in Egypt do not share similarities or many similarities with the Muslim Brotherhood. In fact, they adhere to the Saudi interpretations of Islam.
Can you give us an example?
Of course, in terms of what they wear. So that is something that they emphasize. The religious traditions that they draw from, the Salafi figures that they draw from, particularly someone like Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Abdul Wahhab. So Salafis in Egypt would not draw from the same sources as members of the Muslim Brotherhood. In fact, they will talk about Ibn Baz, who was the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia. Their periodicals, for example, would have references to Ibn Abdul Wahhab, to Ibn Taymiyyah, and these are all historical Salafi figures. And when it comes to the Salafis in Egypt, they often travel to Saudi Arabia. They were educated in Saudi Arabia, and many of them became so prominent, not in Egypt, but they became so prominent in Saudi Arabia. In fact, one of them became a member of the board of senior clerics in Saudi Arabia.
Oh, wow.
So in terms of their understanding of Islam, the sources that they draw from, I would say that the Salafis in Egypt are a lot closer to the Saudis rather than members of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt.
Does that actually have political reverberations or connotations? Like, do the Salafis have a different, let's say, relationship to political participation than the Muslim Brotherhood does, or towards women than the Muslim Brotherhood does? What is their relationship to the society they're in?
Absolutely. And I would say that the Salafis and the Muslim Brotherhood are in conflict because they disagree on women's political participation and the legitimacy of non-Sunni sects and Islamic mysticism. On all these matters, the Brotherhood tends to be less conservative and fundamentalist. When it comes to political participation, the Muslim Brotherhood allows women to participate in politics, but more importantly, run as candidates.
Right.
And this was so controversial because the Salafis refused to allow women to run as candidates. In fact, they discourage women from voting for a very long time. I think there are trends within the Salafis that are trying to push boundaries and change how they view women's place in society. But one could argue that for a very long time, the Salafis differ and contradicted the Muslim Brotherhood's ideals and vision for women's participation in politics.
But the men are encouraged to vote, because based on the definition you gave, that goes against that definition if you're emulating the first three generations of the righteous Muslims.
Again, what I find so interesting about Salafism as well is that there's so many interpretations. It's vibrant. There's diversity within the tradition as well. And they continue to respond and adapt to their changing circumstances. Maybe not in the 60s when it comes to voting or participating in politics, but today there are a number of Salafi parties and they encourage their supporters to vote in elections. So we're looking at a movement that continues to evolve as well. And as a result of that evolution, we're also looking at fragmentation within the Salafi tradition. And in some countries, voting is permissible. In fact, Salafi groups organize their own political parties, they participate in elections. And in other countries, some of them are more take a purist approach where election is not really encouraged because for them you don't vote for another human being, you only devote yourself to God. And here I would again emphasize that local context play an important role when we're trying to understand how Salafi groups operate.
We have an audio clip of a lecture by a Salafi cleric. Let's take a listen.
في هذا اللقاء سأحرص على أن أتحدث عن مسألة تتكرر حقيقة في كثير من مسائل الجدل والنقاش والحوار بين طلبة العلم، سواء كان حوارا مكتوبا أو شفهيا مما أسمعه يتداول كثيرا.
Can you just walk us through, in the three cases that you wrote about in your latest book, how the local context has made each Salafi group in Saudi, Kuwait, and Egypt different from each other, even though they're in these transnational networks because of their local context?
Thank you, Naghmeh. And this is an amazing question, but it's not an easy one to answer because there's so many examples. I think perhaps I can look at the Shia question. And according to at least the basic understanding of Salafism, there are practices within the Shia faith that are considered removed from Islam, including shrine visitations, including praying to Shia imams or visiting shrine cities. According to Salafis, when you allow imams to intercede, that is considered as kufr, which means is an act of infidelity. And for the Salafis, some of them are not very careful when they discuss the Shia question. Some of them are so inflammatory in responding to the Shia question. So they declare the infidelity of Shia believers. And here you have Salafi clerics who would question that approach and say that you can't just declare the infidelity of Shia believers. You have to be very careful when it comes to declaring the infidelity of others. And here I would argue that local context play an important role. In the case of Kuwait, when you're looking at the population of Kuwait, you have a vibrant Shia community. You could argue that there's engagement with the Shia community. Salafi clerics in Kuwait are actually more careful when it comes to dealing with the Shia neighbors. And I think that they feel that they have to be a bit more cautious when they talk about the Shia. This is not the case in Egypt, which is quite surprising because you don't have many Shia in Egypt. In fact, one would argue that the population of Shia in Egypt is around 100,000 maximum. So here we're looking at a small population, and yet the rhetoric is so divisive. Salafi clerics are not careful when they talk about the Shia in Egypt. And that's probably because they don't engage with the Shia very much. The Shia in Egypt are treated as a distant, deviant group, according to Salafi clerics in Egypt. And perhaps it explains why they're more hostile towards the Shia in Egypt. And in the case of Saudi Arabia has a vibrant Shia population, but again, they have to also be very careful when it comes to the Shia in Saudi Arabia. And here they respond to how the state deals with the Shia. So the religious establishment in particular, when the state promotes reconciliation with the Shia, the religious establishment will take a step back when dealing with the Shia question. But when the state shows hostility towards Iran, hostility towards Syria, that's when the Salafi clerics in Saudi Arabia start issuing religious rulings. They will criticize Shia believers as well as various Shia sects. So you can see how they respond to the changing circumstances. And, one could argue that they also respond to state relations with the Shia domestically as well as externally.
I want to stay on this topic of the relationship between Salafis and state power. But before we do, can you just give us a sense of how big is this community that we're spending all this time talking about? Is it the majority of clerics, let's just say in these three countries? Is it the minority? Just a sense of the size.
That's a very good question, and I would say another very difficult question to answer for me. I haven't really done much research on identifying the size of Salafis in these countries, but I would say in the case of Saudi Arabia, it is the Saudi religious tradition. So Salafism is the Saudi religious tradition. So the religious establishment in Saudi Arabia promotes Salafi ideals, and they draw from Salafi sources. In the case of Kuwait, you have, different groups as well in Kuwait, but the Salafis are politically active, and some of them are not politically active, but they continue to preach Salafi ideals. And many would argue that Salafis came to Kuwait in the 1960s, and they were influenced by what was happening in Saudi Arabia, and some of the clerics actually brought Salafism to Kuwait. In the case of Egypt, I would say it's not as significant as Al-Azhar or even the Muslim Brotherhood. It's much smaller.
Al-Azhar being the main center of religious learning in Cairo?
Absolutely, and seen or known as the bastion of Sunni Islam. So you have students from South Asia traveling to Egypt and studying there. My father is included in that list of students who went to Egypt and studied at Al-Azhar. But when it comes to their prominence, I'm talking about Salafi clerics in Egypt, they have been so popular in the region. So Salafi clerics from Egypt travel to Kuwait, travel to Sudan, travel to Morocco, and preach in these countries. And they're very well connected. They're active on social media, and they're very respected in the region. And that's why when I decided to look at this transnational Salafi networks, even though they're not significant in Egypt because you have a different religious tradition that is seen as more pervasive, more grounded in Egypt in comparison to the Salafis. But I thought that the Salafis in Egypt are actually more popular and quite prominent in the region.
Fascinating. Let's go back to a really important topic that you raised, which has to do with the relationship of Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince in Saudi, who basically came into power in 2015, and his relationship with Saudi clerics. Since he gained power, so many prominent Saudi clerics have been arrested, they have left the country, and it's given this impression, I think, that because he's a I'm using my quotes here, modern ruler, he has been suppressing the Salafi clerics in Saudi. Would you agree with this idea? And what are the implications of that development for this fundamental notion that you gave us, which is Wahhabism and Salafism are not one and the same, but deeply, deeply tied to each other?
I think you can't really avoid discussing Muhammad ibn Salman, I suppose, when it comes to Salafism and trying to understand the place of religion or Salafism in Saudi Arabia under his reign. So I would argue that he has used his immense political power to change the place of religion in Saudi Arabia, and especially the place of the Saudi Salafi tradition. But having said that, it's not really new for Saudi rulers to do that. In the past, King Faisal bureaucratized the religious sphere, and he wanted to ensure that the ulama operated within the purview of the state. King Abdullah similarly initiated a number of reform efforts. So he worked with the religious establishment on some occasions, but on other occasions, he ignored the religious establishment. And one reform was to allow women athletes to participate in the Olympics, for example. And the Saudi religious establishment, after negotiating its position with the state, endorsed the king's decision. What I would say about MBS in terms of his approach and how he is different from past rulers or previous rulers is the pace and the ambition of his program. He wants to change Saudi Arabia, and in many ways, he ignores the traditional practice of negotiating with the Salafi religious establishment. And I would also say that MBS is recalibrating the relations between the state or the ruling family and the Saudi religious establishment. So he's drawing his legitimacy from Saudi Arabia's nationalism and not from Saudi Arabia's religious identity as represented by Salafi or Wahhabi ideals. And I find that really interesting because King Abdullah or King Fahad or King Khalid and previous ruling King Faisal and Ibn Saud himself focus on the partnership between the clerics and the state. And MBS is downplaying that partnership. And here you're looking at a new Saudi Arabia that promotes its superiority, its nationalism, its vision for reform, its vision for something new, something different. It's modernizing. And he's a different kind of ruler from his predecessors. But having said that, I would also be a bit careful when announcing that MBS sidelines Salafi Islam or the Salafi tradition. MBS rejects Salafism or Wahhabism. And I don't think that's true. He hasn't said anything to demonstrate his disdain for the tradition. He talks about moderate Islam. He talks about his respect for Islam. He demonstrates that he himself is quite religious. He's a devout Muslim. He ignores the Salafi tradition, but he doesn't denounce the Salafi tradition. And I think that's really smart on his part, because if you dismantle Salafism in Saudi Arabia, what are you going to replace it with? And I think it's so important to keep Salafi religious tradition as part of the Saudi identity, but at the same time talk about reforming that tradition. And reform, not just in Saudi Arabia, reform in Islam and Muslim societies is part and parcel of how religious traditions respond to circumstances and changing circumstances.
But is that reform if you put people in prison? That doesn't seem like it's reform.
Yeah, I haven't really answered that question. I don't want to sound so sympathetic to what he's doing. But you're absolutely right. I mean, he's also targeting Salafi clerics. And when it comes to reform and debating the Salafi tradition, that practice preceded his tenure. So Salafi clerics have been talking about reform even before Mohammed ibn Salman came to power. So when it comes to allowing women to drive, some Salafi clerics really believed in allowing women to drive. It was not Mohammed ibn Salman who suddenly decides that, wow, today we want women to be allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia. So when I talk about Salafi clerics who are in jail, the saddest thing is that most of them are moderate clerics. Someone like Salman al-Auda, for example, is moderate in his approach towards the Shia. He has been very active in promoting women's rights in Saudi Arabia, trying to promote positive relations with non-Muslims. And we're looking at a cleric who has embraced the idea of reforming the Saudi Salafi tradition, and yet he's in jail. Why is that the case? And here I would argue that someone like him is a threat to Mohammed ibn Salman's power. He has also discussed political reform, not just social reform in Saudi Arabia. I wouldn't say democratic participation per se, but he talks about ensuring that citizens have rights, talking about human rights in Saudi Arabia. So he's definitely a threat to Mohammed ibn Salman's authority. And one way to consolidate his power is to eliminate those who criticize the system. And Salman al-Auda, as well as another cleric by the name of Awad al-Qarni, they're both very critical of the system. Not him per se, but they're very critical of the system and call for reform.
This is really fascinating, but I'm just also wondering whether in some ways you're not arguing that the most reformist of the Salafi clerics are the most threat, not just because of what you rightly pointed out, which is that they call for political reforms, but if, MBS says, I'm the only reforming Wahhabi in Saudi Arabia, any reforming Wahhabi cleric or Salafi becomes then a threat. Is that reading too much into what you're saying?
I think it depends on your political allegiance. And here within the Salafi tradition, some scholars argue that the Salafis can be divided into three categories. One, the quietist. And the quietist Salafis are those who are very supportive of the state. They will do anything to demonstrate loyalty. Second, the activist Salafis. So the activist Salafis promote Salafi ideals, but they also promote political activism. So they continue to agitate, they continue to ask questions, they continue to call for political reforms. And third, the Jihadi Salafis, those who don't really care about anything else except dismantling the system and changing everything, rejecting existing rulers and so on. And if you belong to the first category, even if you call for social reforms, the state would support you. Someone like Mohammed bin Salman would not have any issues with someone like Hatim al-Auni, who's a reformist cleric who talks about changing the Salafi traditions within the framework of the tradition itself without dismantling the Salafi tradition in Saudi Arabia. So he has been very vocal in supporting women's rights. He has been very vocal in allowing music to be embraced in Saudi Arabia. And he has done that even before Mohammed bin Salman came to power. So he is a reformist cleric, but he's also someone who's loyal to the state. But someone like Salman al-Auda, he doesn't belong to the first category. So he's a cleric who talks about social reforms, but also discusses political reforms. And he is a threat to the establishment. And this is where it's really fascinating when it comes to the three categories established by scholars. These categories don't really reflect the diversity within the Salafi traditions. The three categories only discuss Salafi clerics and the way they respond to the state. So if you're a quietist, you support the state. If you're an activist, you challenge the state. If you're a jihadi, you reject everything. But when it comes to social issues, for example, a quietist cleric shares similarities with an activist cleric.
Right.
So how do you then look at the categorizations of Salafi clerics within the framework of the three groups established by some scholars? And that's one of the things I wanted to do in the book, was to really challenge the existing typologies and also demonstrating how Salafism as a movement is actually a lot more complex than how we view Salafism within the framework or existing literature on the subject.
I'm curious as to whether this influencer model of Salafi networks that I know you are interested in other contexts also is radicalizing or moderating the Salafi stance. Do you have a sense of whether there's a difference between what they say on social media and what they say in their writings that are published or in relationship to society?
I feel that when it comes to social media, Salafi clerics, they want to promote themselves. And social media platforms are the best way to promote yourself if you have a bit of a following. And I see Salafi clerics tweeting when they have something to say. And here, other Salafi clerics of a similar political affiliation would endorse their work. So they will retweet. They will quote the tweet and say, look at this sheikh, he's saying this and this, and I agree with him, and people should listen to what he has to say. One example is one of the clerics in Egypt by the name of Said Raslan. So he is a radical loyalist in terms of his approach to the state, loves Muhammad ibn Salman, supports Muhammad ibn Salman, even though he's an Egyptian. And for him, Saudi Arabia represents everything that is right about Salafism. And so you can see that he's very active on social media. What's interesting is that he tweeted one of his sermons, and another cleric in Kuwait, who's also supportive of the Saudi state and very supportive of Muhammad ibn Salman, retweeted his work and said that I don't know Said Raslan very well, but you should listen to him. This guy's great. So I think there's an effort by Salafi clerics to foster collective Salafi identity along quietist activist lines. And if you agree with someone's politics, you support them online. You show that you really like the work that they're doing. And that then translates into an invitation. Oh dear, they sound like academics.
I literally was thinking that, and I was like, I can't say it.
But that's exactly how they've used social media. And I find that really interesting, observing the interactions online as well. And what's interesting is also the bromance. So they become good friends, and then they appear on each other's television shows. A Kuwaiti cleric and an Egyptian cleric appearing on a television show and praising each other and supporting each other. So you see a lot of interactions as well as, I think, support for each other through various social media platforms.
What about in Kuwait? I feel we keep leaving Kuwait out of this.
Kuwait is very different. I think in terms of Kuwait's political system, it's more open in comparison to Saudi Arabia. And here, Salafi clerics in Kuwait are very active. And what they're trying to do is also to promote and Islamize Kuwaiti society. But Kuwait is actually more liberal when you compare it to Saudi Arabia. And that's why they're challenged in Kuwait. And Salafi clerics in Kuwait talk about social conservatism. The loyalist clerics talk about or promote social conservatism, but they're not as aggressive as Salafi clerics in Saudi Arabia because they don't really have that power to enforce social conservatism. You also have the activist trend within Kuwait, and some of them have been pushing boundaries as well. So some of them have been extremely critical of the Shia to a point where people call for their arrest because they're so inflammatory in how they describe the Shia. And Salafis in Kuwait are also very popular in the region, and they are very well financed because you have merchant families who are very supportive of the Salafi cause as well. And having said that, I think things have changed for Salafis in the region. And one could argue that the rise of ISIS really damaged or tainted reputation of Salafis. Many of them are accused of supporting terrorists, accused of endorsing extremism, endorsing jihad in Syria, endorsing jihad in Iraq. And as a result of these accusations, Salafi clerics have been sidelined, not just by the state, but by political commentators who continue to blame them for extremism in the region, be it Egypt, Saudi Arabia, as well as Kuwait. So I think it's very different now when we're looking at Salafism in the region. And it's so easy to blame the Salafis because groups like ISIS, groups like Al-Qaeda draw from the same traditions. And groups like ISIS would quote Ibn Abdul Wahhab, would quote Ibn Taymiyyah, and the same sources that Salafi clerics use. Even though they reject violence, they abhor jihadi Salafism. And some of them have been so critical of jihadi Salafism that they've received death threats from ISIS.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation about how many misconceptions there are when it comes to these Salafi movements. I wanted to ask you one last question, which is there anything in your research that has really taken you by surprise? Something you didn't expect to find and you found, and it made you feel the way I've been feeling throughout this whole conversation?
When I first started my research, when I first started listening to Salafi clerics, I felt that Salafi clerics were very conservative and Salafism is a monolith. And it's very different from the Muslim Brotherhood because people have written on the Muslim Brotherhood. We have a better understanding of the Muslim Brotherhood, or even Al-Azhar as the bastion of Sunni Islam, as an important religious establishment in the Sunni world. And I felt that surely Salafism is more conservative than the other groups. And to some extent, Salafi clerics are more conservative than other groups. They promote social conservatism, but they're also different voices within the Salafi tradition. But what's really interesting is that they promote reform without rejecting the tradition, because they feel that the tradition is open to interpretations, but more importantly, there's room for responding to changing circumstances of your community, regionally, domestically, and globally. Again, I would emphasize that this happens in other religious movements where you have voices within the movement that try to change tradition without dismantling tradition and their religiosity. But for them, it's about responding to how the world is changing and how communities change as well.
Well, thank you, Raihan, so much for this truly illuminating and just such thought-provoking conversation that you had with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Naghmeh.
Our pleasure. You've been listening to Counter Argument, a Middle East podcast from the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University. Please join us next time for more insights into the region's politics, history, society, and economics.